Great, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's discussion on mental health, well-being, and resilience during the pandemic. This event is part of a larger event series on advancing rights and justice during COVID-19, which has been organized by the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, Duke Law's International Human Rights Clinic, Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality, and Just Security. My name is Anjli Parrin, and I'm the Associate Director of the Project on War Crimes and Mass Graves at the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute. Our work seeks to advance rights and further forensic sciences in the Central African Republic. We have an incredible group of thoughtful, brilliant speakers for today's panel from around the world. I'll introduce each of them in the order in which they will present. So first up, we'll have Yara Sallam, who's an Egyptian feminist and legal researcher based in Cairo. Yara has worked on diverse issues, including criminal justice, regional and international human rights mechanisms, transitional justice, freedom of religion and belief, and women's rights defenders. Following that, we have Yvette Alberdingk-Thijm, who's the executive director of Witness, an organization that helps people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights. Yvette envisions a world where anyone can participate in creating human rights change and leads the global network of activists to work alongside marginalized communities to support the safe, effective, and ethical uses of media and technology to fight for equality and justice. Third up, we have Douglas Matthew Mawadri, who is a founding member and coordinator of the Associates of Health Rights Uganda, a registered organization providing mental health and wellness advocacy. He's a Ugandan lawyer and human rights defender. Mr. Mawadri has worked with the LGBT and sex workers communities for over 6 years, providing legal support, emergency response services, and risk analysis, as well as LGBT asylum for persons seeking protection. And finally, we have Margaret Satterthwaite, who's a professor of clinical law, faculty director of the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, and director of the Global Justice Clinic at NYU School of Law. Her research interests include legal empowerment, economic and social rights, human rights and counterterrorism, and the well-being of human rights workers. In terms of the format for today's discussion, each of our speakers will speak for about 7 or 8 minutes, and then participants can tweet questions using the hashtag COVID-19 Justice, or using the Q&A section, the Q&A module within Zoom. So we'll start off with Yara.
Thank you, Anjli, for the introduction, and thank you for having me on this this panel. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, okay, perfect. So I just want to start off with to say that I think a lot of us who are working in the human rights field are having like some common mental load these days. So a lot of us, or a lot of activists have lost their ability to organize, or the ability to organize has been very restricted. And then there's the problem with the rise of domestic violence and against women, and the inability to actually respond to that adequately. And the third one is the lack of space to actually criticize governments for their response to the pandemic. This can be new to some defenders, but for others, including human rights defenders in Egypt, this has been the case for a couple of years now. This hasn't been new. And I think the only thing that we all share in this pandemic time is that none of our governments was prepared to respond to such health crisis. Other than that, I think we all experience this period differently. So depending on the privileges that we have, if we have a house, if we can have access to water, if we have to be confined with abusive partners or other people. So I think this brings me to my main point about like how human rights defenders deal with their workload at the moment, and how they can actually, this narrative about being productive. So there's a discussion about like how this time we all need to be productive in a way that now we have more free time. But the other counter argument is that actually this view of productivity or work-related production is very capitalist. And then there's another counter argument about how we actually view productivity. So for many of us, or for many people, including human rights defenders, including women human rights defenders, there's a lot of unappreciated labor, or labor that is usually unpaid, that is usually placed on women, related to emotional care of like family members, either like children or parents or other people, as well as housework that maybe we're not used to be doing. And in between, some of us feel that we're not very useful at the moment because of the work that the kind of work that we're doing. Some countries have like the court suspended, so lawyers don't have much to do, or maybe people who have actually other specialization that is not related to COVID or the impact of COVID. So I think the issue around well-being is to understand that although we all are going through the same health crisis, but we're going through it differently, and that there's no kind of prescription or advice that we should all follow, and that we should, it all depends on each of our situations, what kind of work that we're doing. If people are working on right to health, they can have an aspect to COVID-19, but people working, for example, on war crime, is going to be very difficult for them to have this aspect integrated. So I think we should just unpack this idea of productivity, or the way things were before COVID-19, like how things, like at this moment, it's not only about surviving, it's about also looking into how we view productivity and how we include house labor and emotional labor into our idea of being productive. And I think this is key to accept the moment that we're in, with the anxiety that it entails, and how much time we're taking to actually cope with the new kind of arrangement in our homes, and as well as dealing with our colleagues in different mediums. Not everyone have the same internet connections, for example, and like access to a quiet room to speak about work. So all of these little inconveniences related to life is very difficult to put in place in one routine that is viable for everyone. So I think this should be in the back of our head when we're thinking about well-being, when we're thinking about working as human rights defenders in our organizations, but also organizing with communities, that things are new. This is the first, at least in my lifetime, this is the first pandemic, or this is the first global health crisis that I've been through. And I think we should not hold on tight to how life was before, or how organizing was before. So we can at least try to adjust in a way that is useful for us and for the people that we're working with. That's it for now, and I'll continue later in the question. Thank you, Anjli.
Thanks, Yara, for that really helpful delineation of the political nature and the need to think about not just emotional well-being, but how it factors into the kind of work and productivity that we might be thinking about. I'll turn next to Yvette to talk a little bit about the ways in which Witness has been working.
Thank you, and thanks, Anjali, and thanks for putting together this really important conversation and bringing us all together. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I think it's this kind of community that is what we need, all of us, in these moments. Just to pick up on something that Yara said, this is not new. The stresses for human rights defenders are not new. The pressures on everyone is not new. But I think that, as we all know, COVID has just provided an enormous guise for abusive powers to accelerate some of the violence that is happening. And it also is making it extremely clear that particularly the communities that were already quite vulnerable have additional vulnerabilities right now. So for us, as a global team around the world, we work very closely with many different partners. And I thought maybe it might be helpful to just sort of explain a little bit how we're thinking about this and what we're learning. And I think, again, like we're learning this very much as a community by nobody has perfect answers, but constantly kind of listening and figuring out what we do. So obviously, as we noted, it's a human rights crisis. I think the way we have thought about this from the beginning, not just in the context of COVID, but in general, thinking about how do we as a movement become sustainable, is always on three levels. One is sort of on the systemic level, one is on the organization level, and one is on the individual level. So on the systemic level, we really think of ourselves as being part of a larger ecosystem that has massive pressures in it that have to do with how human rights abuses happen, but it also has to do with how philanthropy is supporting this or not. So really constantly thinking of how do we show up in this broader systemic problem, as opposed to boiling it down to the tireless human rights activist. So constantly trying to figure out, so if you even think about the concept of mental health or sustainability, is that it is incredibly important to realize that that you can't put it on the individual activist per se to a responsibility to make your work sustainable, because we are all in an environment that puts constant pressures on us, and unless you take the systemic pressures away or you really address those, then you're literally putting buckets under a waterfall. So we think about that a lot. On an organizational level, we think a lot about very concrete things such as what are the policies that we have in place and how are we organizing our work, or how are we even talking about our work, and what is our work's progress really look like. And then on an individual level, everyone is entirely different. I think what we share is we came to this movement because we believe in a purpose, which is creating a just world. But other than that, we come to this with a lot of very different ways in which we may be resilient or not. So anything we do always takes into account. Many of us are members of affected communities, sort of constantly take into account the individual. And then maybe there are sort of three principles. One is you always have to ask first and listen. Like, you don't know necessarily where the stresses are coming from, so begin with really listening. I've learned, for example, in our team that where you may feel that sort of the increase of violence in Kenya under curfews, which I'm sure Douglas is also quite familiar with, is maybe the thing that is a key stressor. It may literally be that people stress because their partner has lost their job, or it may be stressing because they're worried about the financial situation of the organization. So you really just don't know. So you have to start by asking and really listening. The second sort of key thing we think about is words really matter. Like again, back to Yara's point about productivity and the capitalist system, like a word like solidarity right now, I think is a much more important word to use than productivity or even the word impact, right? And words really matter in terms of how we're showing up with each other. And then I think the third one is really rely on the existing fabric of the community, the structure, the organization, the ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, that you're in. Don't create new structures to try to make things sustainable. The strength is within the community. And I think if you start there, then you can start thinking well about how you respond. So maybe I'll give a couple of very concrete examples. So on the systemic level, one of the things we try to do a lot is advocate to funders. And particularly now, and particularly as a responsibility to say, look, there's a lot of additional pressure on people. But the other thing we're, for example, doing right now is saying many people have been in this fight for a very long time. Be careful that you don't give it all your funding purely to only healthcare. And I'm not saying that isn't incredibly important right now, but don't undermine a lot of the other threats and human rights injustices that are actually going to even more affect all the communities we work with. And I think that's an actually really, really important piece to keep in mind. And then also really systemically, it's a very long arc to justice, right? Like, so constantly reminding ourselves that we are on a long journey, but we are on it together. And that this sense of urgency that we all feel, rightfully feel, putting it into a historical perspective, or putting it into perspective of a lot of gains that have been made in the human rights movement, I think is systemically very important. On an organizational level, like one of the things we try to do is use narrative and talk about our work and why we do it in ways that hopefully we don't use the word tireless activist. We try to message a lot about the fact that we are humans, and if you are human, you're going to be affected by the work that you are doing, and maybe particularly now you're going to be even more affected by it. So if you feel exhausted, or if you are having a difficult moment, it's because you're human. It's not because you're failing as an activist. And I think that's an incredibly important message. And there's several people around us in the movement who are making very strong points about that. What we did in the beginning of the crisis was first sort of listen a little bit to what's everybody feeling. And a lot of our concern is not just with our direct team, but it's also with all the communities we very closely collaborate with. So we started really thinking about making almost like your mission a little bit fluid. You have to stay on mission, but also say like, if right now the most important thing is to support your community in doing a mutual aid network so that people have food, please do it, right? Like if that's where you are best placed as an activist with your existing solidarity, then there's no reason you wouldn't do that right now. And we also immediately kind of took the pressure off people to feel that they had to be productive, because people had many different ways in which they had to show up, whether it is for their family, many with different ways they had to show up for their community. People's individual situations were very different. So we instituted basically sort of a team agreement that said, it's okay. So if you can be productive, you're going to be productive, or if you feel like you can work, you can progress your plan, great. If you can't, but let's not judge each other on that. We're just all going to try to complement each other as we're collectively trying to work. And I think we also did very concrete things, like we instituted care days. So you didn't really have to explain why you wouldn't show up, but you just don't have to show up. We really created spaces for people to talk, like whether it's a chat on Slack, or whether it is what we call the Witness Quarterly Share, or yesterday we did something that we call story time, where it's just like spaces to kind of talk to each other that doesn't have immediately to do with, oh, I need you to help me to do X, Y, Z, or can you help me figure out how to do an online training, but just kind of really connect to each other. We created listening pods. We're just sort of experimenting, but the baseline is creating space for people to really talk to each other, because we know that there are challenges about doing that online. And then I think on the individual side of things, it's of course you have to make sure that people can have the tools, but the tools need to be very tailored to what people specifically need. So for somebody, it may be a spiritual healer. We created like a trauma fund for it, because we were also learning that many professionals don't really know how to coach or support people who are human rights activists, but like giving people a lot of space to sort of pick their own ways in which they can be more resilient, and then trying to share a lot of stuff with each other in terms of, I just right before this shared a contemplation about care by Adrienne Marie Brown. So that's sort of, for example, somebody that we believe has a really great community take on how do you do collective care and how do you do self-care. So we try to, among all of us, share these kinds of tips with each other, whether it's about homeschooling or whether it's about how to stay really sane. So that's broadly how we're thinking about it. We also, from a leadership perspective, try to communicate as much and as honestly as we can. So for example, one of the real challenges is that we don't really know what our budget is going to look like. So what we try to do is be as transparent about it. So what we know, make sure the team actually knows it. And the other side of that financial part is also understanding that because we're part of an ecosystem, many of our partners are also losing funding or you know, don't even have funding to begin with. So how do we try to then talk to people to say, well, in order for all of us to do our work, other people need to get resources as well. So that's sort of a couple of things that we do, and constantly talk to other people in the movement to say, what are you learning? What's working? What's not working? Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette, for that really clear presentation of how organizations can work and respond in this moment, and for laying out the sort of 3 principles of asking and listening, ensuring that your words matter, and then really relying upon the existing structures that exist within a community. And also thinking about concrete ways in which we can work together while remaining distant. Douglas, I'll turn it over to you to explain a little bit about what you're doing in Uganda.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for inviting me to be part of this panel to discuss COVID-19 and mental health and what activists are doing in Uganda. Well, first and foremost, COVID-19 presents a very new and unprecedented event that has never been seen before in the human rights community and within human rights defenders in Uganda. That said, it has, that said, each and every single person has been asked to stay at home in compliance with the Ministry of Health and in the government directives, and in they also to self-isolate, you know, under the directive of the Public Health COVID-19 Amendment Regulations. So that said, it has almost enabled each and every single human rights defender and human rights organizations to become non-essential service providers. As such, they cannot actually provide services for their beneficiaries. And every human rights defender and every organization actually feel that they cannot do so much, albeit of the fact that there are human rights violations that keeps to happen almost every other day. There keeps to be the arrests and detentions of LGBT persons, sex workers, the youth, and across board, they keep to be arrested. They keep to be arrests of individuals, LGBT persons, and so many other persons, almost in the way of enforcing the presidential directive, and more so for the LGBT persons, it is more or less like a scapegoat, following up the enactment of the Anti-Homosexuality Act way back in 2014. So this, in other words, presents a new form of arrest and detention by the authorities, so that it will look as if people are being arrested and detained in the cover of COVID-19, but also in the way of trying to ensure that LGBT persons are also face, you know, the wrath of the law so hardly. So that said, because of such, activists are asked to stay at home, to isolate and to enforce the presidential directions, and they feel that really they cannot do so much. So as such, the level of anxiety, the level of, they feel that you can't do much to help your societies has really gone up. They also keeps, they also arrest, besides arrest, their unemployment of the LGBT community that keeps, you know, going on because of, first and foremost, of their sexuality. People are asked to stay at home, and because people are asked to stay at home, there are also cases of intimate partner violence. There are cases of domestic violence. There are cases of individuals coming out and identifying and talking about their sexuality to their parents. And these are not on their own volition, but they are induced because of the circumstance that COVID-19 actually presents. So that said, these cases keeps coming up, and they keep piling, and human rights defenders, for that matter, that cannot really so much offer so much. One of the things that they arrest LGBT persons for is that they are in Uganda. There are shelters that host LGBT communities. You know, so one of the things, at one material time, they arrested 23 individuals, and because the presidential directive said that there should be only 10 people who actually should stay in a gathering. And these are people who are staying in a shelter, and these are people who are actually homeless, and because of they have been evicted by their family, or banished by their family members, they can only have safe space in the LGBT shelter. So for that matter, they were arrested, and they were told that because there are more than 10 in a shelter, they cannot actually stay in such a place. So that then presents a new scapegoat, and they were told that they were arrested and detained because their acts are actually negligently spreading infectious diseases. So as such, this then presents a new way of presenting, rather arresting and detaining LGBT persons and justifying it on COVID-19. These are basically ramifications of the Anti-Homosexuality Act that was way back in 2014. So what right now what we do as an organization, as communities, and as human rights defenders and organizations is that before 19, we had tenders and SMAG, but the associates for health rights together with the Visa Collective. So we try to bring down communities to have a peer mental health focal groups within organizations to be able to respond to the community needs. And as such, we have to be able to respond to the concerns of their communities, and more so concerns are rising as a result of mental health. So by creating this community, this committee of peer groups, it has enabled people to fairly and effectively respond to some of the cases within their communities. And we are basically using the peer training, we are basically using the peer model to ensure that the peers get to their other members within the communities, which of course we know that we cannot get. So this has presented a way of working remotely online to be able to talk and engage with some of the community members. We have also developed online risk management tools and best practices that we can follow to mitigate all the risks that communities and individuals go through. And more so, these are through the human rights defenders and human rights organizations that were identified during our Fire That Fuels training. So this has enabled people to have a little bit of better understanding, a little bit of how mental health actually manifests in individuals, and also what are the best mitigating factors they can use at this material time to be able to respond to the cases that do come to their organizations, and also how they feel in respect to how they can cope with this situation. Because as I said, it is definitely a very unprecedented that has never been felt before within these organizations. We have also gone ahead and create through our peer model and peer training and peer counseling system, we have created a culture of solidarity within human rights organizations and within human rights defenders to be able to basically check on each other using online platforms, and also to be able to communicate and avail toll-free phone numbers so that people who require some of the services can be able to respond and manage some of the measures or manage anxiety, depression, or any other mental health related kind of issues that are raised within the communities. We have kept documenting cases of violence, and of course we know that we cannot respond to it at this material time. We definitely have to respond to it at some other time once when COVID-19 subsides. And of course there are individuals who actually exhibit much more other characters that we think that it requires physical attending to these issues other than having even online discussions. But so at the moment, we are basically using online processes to be able to reach out to some of those individuals and avail our services. But we think, and at future date, we definitely need to create a much more concrete measures on how to address these issues, because some people are definitely acting suicidal. There are people who have lost their employment, and as such, they don't know where to start from, and they become even much more, a threat to themselves as opposed to, there was an issue that Yvette had raised in respect to how human rights defenders do feel. It affects definitely you, but it goes way ahead beyond yourself to also affect the organization that you work for. So these are some of the intersectional things that we need to actually we actually do consider to ensure that as you are important, your organization is more so, you are much more important to yourself, so that if you're not important to yourself, definitely you cannot provide services for your organization. So we definitely have measurement. We have mitigating factors we thought could work right now by way of online, creating online follow-up of the cases and working with the peer mechanism, the peer groups, the peer committees that we have created to provide technical support. We do participate in weekly discussions where organization heads like the coordinators or the coordinators, the coordinators and the respective focal persons come in place to discuss the issues that their communities actually identify with. So we basically follow up these cases, and we do provide support from within our respective respective expertise. This is by way of asking us to be able to identify some of the measures, the best practices that we can use across, you know, the globe with our friends and allies, and also with the scholars in respect to identifying which are those best practices that you can use to be able to mitigate some of the issues that are raising. So what do we need like this material time? Definitely, we have been shown with COVID-19 that there are gaps that the communities need to know. Besides the communities knowing these gaps, we need to address these gaps as and when, because always people come and address what they want to raise issues at the time of crisis. But why we now, our model right now is to prepare ourselves to handle any type of crisis as and when it arises. So what we intend to do after COVID is that we intend to have a better training for the focal persons we have identified, to be able to guide them with better tools to be able to address issues of COVID-19 and any crisis that might arise within their communities and within their organizations. And we know for a fact that we have elections in the next year, general elections. So definitely during this time, the number of persons, of LGBT persons of violence of LGBT persons will rise up. So we need to put measures to be able to address these issues even before they arise. And that is by way of training focal persons within organizations with better mental health tools to be able to address and gain resilience as they do the advocacy. We also plan to develop better online tools to mitigate this to mitigate the issues that the human rights defenders do raise and raised and also raised by their committee members. We can only do this by way of peer group and going through the committee members, because that's the only way we can possibly reach a wider spectrum of individuals. We also continue to provide. We will also continue to provide and continue to provide technical support to encourage organizations and HRDs to adopt the peer-based centered human rights approach as a tool to be able to address the respective concerns that the human rights defenders and also organizations do raise. Of course, we take note of each and every single gap that comes across, and we see if and when we can provide the best remedies and mitigate these issues and gaps arising. We also intend to facilitate safe space for peer mental health focal persons to develop their skills in respect to responding to the mental health cases, and this is by regularizing our trainings with focal persons and ensuring that at least they're up to date with what they're doing, and also identifying new skills and measures to be able to address this. Of course, we know through research that each and every single time a new research comes with better solutions to some of the issues that arise. And also, one of the issues is we intend to create partnerships and to create alliances with human rights defenders and human rights organizations nationally and internationally to be able to bring in the best practices that organizations can use and utilize within their organizations, and also by human rights defenders in respect to doing advocacy. The only way we can do this is by having unified ways of programs. And one of the strengths that we have at Associates for Health Rights is to bring together human rights defenders and to bring together organizations that do and ensuring that they have a unified way of addressing issues. As we had our Fire That Fuels human rights training in October, hosted at SMAG, one of the things was that human rights organizations did not know how to address and attend to mental health issues. And these are programs also that didn't form part of their programmings in their organizations. So we are trying to encourage organizations to adopt and have mental health programs within their organizations so that they have programs that can address this. And we shall definitely keep monitoring and working with the human rights defenders and the focal persons as the peer focal persons identified within these organizations to be able to champion mental health and anything that leads to resilience for human rights defenders. Well, I think that's it right now for my presentation, and thank you.
Thanks, Douglas, for both laying out the new vulnerabilities and the exacerbated harms that are occurring for vulnerable groups in Uganda, and the ways in which human rights defenders are trying to respond online to community needs while looking after themselves through a peer support model. And so finally, I'll turn it over to Meg to talk a little bit about the research that you've been doing and what the research is showing about well-being and resilience for human rights advocates.
Great, thanks so much. And the first thing I want to say is thank you all. And it's really such an incredible honor to be on this panel with those of you who've already spoken. I am here really to give a little bit, as Anjli said, of our research findings. And so this will be slightly more kind of abstract, but I hope it'll be a contribution as well. And I won't take up too much time so that we can hear back from the advocates. And here I will try to start a PowerPoint and share my screen. There we go. Do you see the slides? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing to say is that I'll be talking about research that's done with a group, including Sarah Nucky, Ria Sahani Singh, Rohini Bargrodia, Adam Brown, Katie Whiteman, and in fact, Anjli as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some key things that I think are potentially relevant, but it's important to say that research right now is probably not the #1 thing we need, and we're really offering it as hopefully a bit of ammunition, if you will. So particularly for people like seeking funding, sometimes data and findings can be helpful, and also sometimes hopefully they can help put stuff into context. So a couple of things that have already been said really, and I'm going to be using this language of trauma, and I'm going to be using a language of resilience as well, but there's tons of different vocabularies, of course, that are used in this space. And I think the #1 thing that's already been pointed out is, of course, we're constantly dealing with trauma in this space, in the human rights defender space, because we're looking at how to shift power. And power structures systematically traumatize the people they oppress, right? And then dehumanize the oppressors. So to go back very beginning of what Yara said, all of us are experiencing this current crisis differently. And that has to do with where we are situated in these intersectional versions of different power structures. Of course, fighting the impact of these systems is hard, and it's often just basically very soul crushing. And so resilience is really needed to stay in this fight for the long term. So we all know, and folks have already said this, the work can really feed us and can really give us our passion and help us stay engaged, but it also can be difficult when we start to lose that sense of feeding. And so at those moments, I think it can be really helpful to think of resilience as a form of resistance, and to think about how can we tap back into that energy in this crisis. So a couple things that have been found in the research about advocates and advocacy. So advocates, and again, these are very different across different spaces, so reject any of this as desired, but may be helpful in contextualizing some of the things that folks are going through right now. Advocates often prioritize their work or their activism over their personal well-being. They tend to be people who are deeply sensitive to injustice, right? So really keen to that sense of oppression. Sometimes deny their own needs in light of the gravity of human rights abuses or oppression that they're working on and that they see going on that need to stop. They often feel morally obliged to work to the point of physical and emotional exhaustion. You know, how many times have we all said, well, the only thing I can do is give my all, right? And often there's a belief that well-being is a self-indulgent thing, that it's not actually part of the work itself. And then, of course, many human rights advocates have a history of trauma as well. And I'm just going to talk about that very briefly. In a study that we did looking at human rights advocates, we found that almost 40% of them reported experiencing significant effects of trauma. And so that included both post-traumatic stress disorder, so people who really were experiencing very intrusive forms of trauma and the effects of trauma, and then a large set of people who also were experiencing many of those what would be called symptoms by psychologists or psychiatrists, but many of those things that are intruding but not necessarily reaching that diagnostic. But the point here really is it's a very common thing in our field, in our movements, in our communities, that folks are experiencing this kind of trauma. And of course, people of color and people who are objects of oppression and discrimination experience these forms of trauma at much higher rates. We asked human rights advocates in relation specifically to their human rights advocacy, were they experiencing or had they ever experienced anxiety, depression, or PTSD? And we found that the rates were very, very high there as well. So just to put that into context, 35% of people taking our survey reported this general sense of anxiety related to their human rights work. 22% reported depression, and then 32% reported PTSD symptoms directly related to their human rights work. From the kind of literature on psychology and looking at social movements, we know that often you can be more vulnerable if you have a history of economic struggle, a history of trauma, of oppression and intergenerational trauma that comes from systematic forms of oppression, if you experience mental health issues. And then one that I always like to point out to my law students, those of us who might see ourselves as perfectionists, that can often be really troubling and difficult in times of crisis. So this slide is about a recent piece of research that we did asking human rights advocates at an organizational level. So Yvette really invoked beautifully, the fact that there's individual level stress and impacts, there's organizational, and then there's movement or systems level. And here are the things that human rights advocates themselves said that they felt were the causes for burnout and PTSD for human rights folks. And this was before COVID, remember. So what we just talked about, vicarious and direct exposure to trauma, the experience of bias and discrimination within our organizations and within our movements, the stress of overwork, the precarious and poor working conditions that a lot of human rights advocates experience, so just not having what you need to do the work, not having sufficient resources. Bad management was something that was stressed a lot. And then a sense of inefficacy. So this sense that no matter what we do, our work is actually not having the impact that we want it to have. So if we think about those all pre-COVID, you can see how then the COVID situation is really cutting across and exacerbating a lot of these probably in very specific ways for different people and different organizations and different movements. And so you could say, we start with this health crisis. It's an economic crisis at the same time. And then for all of us, it's a human rights and social justice crisis, because those who are at the most receiving end of the most devastating impacts of this, of course, are people who are experiencing systematic discrimination and oppression. And so we all are then experiencing this as a social justice crisis as well, which could then lead to a sense of a mental health crisis. So all of these things are kind of interrelated in a very intimate way in this context of COVID. So I'm gonna just finish very quickly, because I think it's much more important that we hear from the other folks on this call, but a couple of things that people have said and reported that are useful. One, I think, is recognizing that we are being impacted by trauma, that we're experiencing it, and that people are experiencing it differently, right? And so some folks have, in social movement theory, have said, oh, well, this is a moment, a triggering moment, right? It might be a moment for us to actually see new openings to social change. But it's also a triggering moment, literally, right, for people who've experienced trauma, in that there are just triggers that are abounding for folks to be re-experiencing the kind of trauma inside their homes, inside their movements, and in a sense of this moment of crisis. redefining and lifting up what works now, and I think Yara is starting by deconstructing the concept of productivity is beautiful here. I think thinking about, even as we're doing human rights work, what actually works is going to be very different across different spaces. And I love Yvette's idea of redefining that and giving space for people to figure out what's needed now, if we're talking about partners, if we're talking about our communities, and defining that as what we actually need and what we can make work. And that goes to that sense of inefficacy, right? If we're feeling like huge injustices are occurring, and we know that right now, it's important that we keep working on all of those, but it's also important that we see small things that we can do on a daily basis as having an effect. And I think even just seeing all of you talking and knowing the effects that maybe a comment that Douglas said might have on something that I'm trying to do, that can help us with our sense of efficacy and our sense that we do have an impact in this world. And that really moves to solidarity, and Yvette mentioned this as well. Solidarity right now is really asking that question, what is it that you're going through? What is it that I can bring to that? Here's what I'm going through, and finding that space where we can actually hold and lift each other up. Reconnecting with our sense of purpose can be very empowering, but also in a sense of being very gentle with ourselves and knowing that that sense of purpose can wax and wane in these moments of crisis. It can be very difficult. One of the things that Human Rights Advocate said to us was really valuable before COVID was this idea of sharing a sense of shared vision that we all have together and are constructing together senses of what a just world will look like. And that the meaning that we bring to our work is in sharing that. So I just wanted to sort of end with that idea that we have to find new ways to connect on that in this time when we're really being physically apart from each other, that there need to be ways for us to bring those visions and to create meaning, both alone and together. And I'll just finish with this quote from an advocate in Brazil who said, activism isn't only what hurts us, but it also heals us, right? So it's this idea that working in solidarity with movements and with communities bring us back to being whole, and they bring us back to connecting with each other again. And so there I'll just end with this beautiful concept that comes out of Black feminism here in the US, the concept of healing justice. So this quote, I think that a lot of us have used as a touchstone from Audre Lorde: caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And then I think Prentice Hemphill brings up this beautiful idea that we heal to uncover and to offer our contribution. So healing ourselves and bringing ourselves to a space where we can reconnect with that fire that does fuel us, as Douglas was saying, can be a way of bringing our contribution back as well. And I will stop there and hand it back to Anjli.
Thank you so much, Meg, for really tying together how the research and what advocates around the world are already saying on this issue, and thinking through how folks are managing both the current impacts, lifting up what works currently, thinking through about how they can be more in solidarity with each other and connecting back to their purpose and the meaning of the work as ways to build and continue to foster greater resilience during this time. We have a couple of questions that have just come in. One of the ones that has come in, which maybe I'll ask Yara to speak to, and then possibly also Yvette. Somebody asks, how do I pursue or work with my senior colleagues to come up with tools and solutions for addressing mental health and well-being? What are strategies I could use with my more senior colleagues? Maybe Yara, I can have you chime in first, and then Yvette, and as someone in sort of senior leadership, you can also speak to what might work.
Sure. First, this definitely it has to be on the table. It's really difficult to engage with senior management if the conversation around well-being is not already on the table, right? So it's really difficult to speak to your manager if she or he is actually overworking herself or overworking himself and doing all sorts of things that are like, you just lead by example. Nevertheless, I think it's a good moment for those of us who are working in NGOs or activist groups, that the conversation haven't happened yet, to actually open it up. First, like there's a lot of people who are right now exploring different online mediums to communicate together. So a lot of check-ins to make sure that everyone is all right, a lot of flexibility around working hours, but also this is a little bit risky because of like this bridging about personal space and work time and when this ends and when this starts. But I think I'm privileged enough to be working in an organization that is actually have put well-being in a very important place. But I would definitely talk about, for example, flexibility of working hours, because this is very important, and rescheduling work plans, because these two issues are very important right now as people are trying to cope with the new routine and making sure that they already have enough brain space to work. And with the lockdown, and it might be the case that defenders have previous experience of confinement, and now it's very anxiety inducing to actually have to be staying in one place. So discussing scheduling work plans and and flexibility is really important. I think making sure that the isolation is not really social isolation, it's just physical isolation. So if there is a possibility to actually discuss with senior management that there would be some kind of a friendly check-ins within the team, or maybe team meetings every week, or there has to be someone who's able to have an eye on everyone, depending on the size, of course, of the organization. If it's an international organization with hundreds of employees, then it falls on smaller teams. But I think this is the right moment. I know it's a difficult conversation to have if senior management is not taking the first step to have it. But I think it's very legitimate, and I think everyone is speaking about it. So it's really, you can bring it up to the table and say, like, listen, this is affecting everyone. It's not only me. So it's not about me being lazy about my work or me not be able to toughen up or whatever it is. I really like what Yvette was saying, that we're not tireless. And explain that we have different responsibilities. So if someone lives on their own is different than someone who has a family, someone who has old parents to take care of. So it's also important to communicate to the senior management your situation. I think it's always important to presume that the other person doesn't really know, and presume that they have good faith, that maybe it's a new thing and they haven't thought about it. So maybe you should come up with a suggestion. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Yara. Yvette, do you have anything to sort of add to that?
I really briefly, because I think Yara covered 99% of it. I would just say that this question is a really good question, and it comes up all the time. And a lot of the stress and a lot comes from the managers. And so this is a very, very frequent question. So the only thing, and it's not always comfortable to bring it up. So the only thing I would say is, if you can absolutely articulate your concerns as much as you can, if you don't feel comfortable, what I've seen, for example, in my organization, this happened literally this morning, is that someone who's more outspoken than somebody else would bring it up very directly and say, oh, well, how is that going to affect my colleagues? So try to partner on it. And then the other thing I would say is, it's very helpful to bring this up in every meeting that you're having and not make it a separate issue. So when you're talking about, okay, let's look at what we can do given that we can't travel, then bring it up. If you are talking about what are we doing on war crimes in the coming year, and how do we think about archiving right now, like bring it up. Like, so it's almost like mainstream it into the organization as much as you can, because it is a question of capacity and plans and many other different things. Yeah, but super good question.
Thanks for that. I have a second question here for Douglas. As you were discussing the ways in which you created a hotline and a toll-free number to support members of the LGBT and sex workers community who may be struggling during this moment, what are the ways in which, or how are the ways in which you're thinking about the people who are manning the hotline and how they are getting support for themselves? What are the ways in which you've been either exploring this question or building in structures of support?
Well, definitely that's one of our concerns as we talk right now, because we know for a fact that our issue is with human rights defenders, and we want to make sure.
I think we just lost Douglas, so we'll be trying to get him back for the last couple of minutes, but I'll move on to the next question, which concerns funders. And maybe for Meg, if you've been thinking about this in terms of the broader research, also pre-COVID, and for the rest of you as well, have you had a sense from either your organizations on the research of how funders are reacting to this, how they're thinking about supporting human rights defenders, and whether they're doing this in a way that is, what's been helpful, what's been harmful?
Sure. So I think it's a very mixed bag. That would be my overall answer to that. I would say that funders are hosting more opportunities to have this conversation. And they certainly are, many of them are bringing up the issue, but whether they're actually putting money where that discussion is a different question. And I see that we have Douglas back. Maybe I will hand it back to you, Anjli, so you can hand it back to him.
Douglas, do we have you back?
Yes, I am. I am. Do you hear me?
Great. Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes. I was saying that actually what our concern is actually with the human rights defenders, and to make them much more effective to be able to perform their duties, we need to ensure that the human rights defenders who are manning these hotlines and who are manning the free calls, they have enough tools to be able to address the very concerns they're even facing, because truth be told, these people are faced with so much of problems. So for every single call they receive, there needs to be a solution for it. That's why we thought of first and foremost having trainings for these individuals to be able to address first of all mental health issues of their own, so that they can be able to they build resilience on some of those issues that they're responding to before any other person else, because they are the foot soldiers of mental health and championing human rights and mental health resilience. So that's why we thought about having trainings for these individuals, so that they know the difference between having your own mental health, guiding your own mental health, and ensuring also that your communities are also catered for. And that then takes us to the point of have to train these individuals to be able to understand, and that is by way of having them equipped with tools of both addressing their mental health concerns, but also addressing the mental health concerns of their communities. And that's where we are now headed to next after COVID. And definitely we need support for this kind of work to be able to have peer focal persons trained with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Douglas. And I think that's all the time we have left. Just to say that all of our panelists are doing incredible and amazing work. And to make a quick plug for Yara Sallam's book that has, I believe, just been translated recently. If you go to her website, you can read it there, and it has really useful information about building resilience among human rights activists and thinking about it from a feminist perspective. And of course, Witness is doing incredible work during the COVID-19 situation, and AHAR is doing fantastic work in Uganda about supporting LGBT activists. Thank you so much for joining today, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you, Anjli. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us, and thanks for organizing this program. Thank you.
Thanks very much.